been running this project, Everything Everywhere All at Once, with Professor Joel Quirk and Dr. Ahmed Variava from the politics department for this year so far. Oh, and thank you for starting the recording and transcription. I appreciate it. So the idea behind the project was that we had found that after COVID, essentially sort of life in the department had shrunk quite dramatically. Across the social sciences, life had shrunk because of the requirements of COVID and the kind of crisis teaching. People were forced to do a lot less. And so the kinds of things that operated around our teaching schedule and the kinds of skills that our students got with our teaching fell away. And we've been trying to rebuild and build that back up and build it back out. And this project is a part of that. So it's called Everything Everywhere All at Once. And essentially, the idea is that we are trying to help students, mostly postgraduate students, to develop the kinds of soft skills that they need to sort of progress in their fields. And of course, as you would know, this is not limited to the politics department nor social sciences. It is operating across the humanities, and we have people who are attending from across the humanities. And so the idea is that it enables students to get skills around abstract writing, conference paper writing, conference presentations, and then hopefully at the very end, the potential for a journal article publication, right? So the idea is that this project enables us to help students to improve their skills at the end of their degrees so that they leave with more than just the degree and more than just what they learned in class. And the other idea as well is that, especially around the conferences, and all of you, I believe, have been accepted to the Anthropology Southern Africa Conference. The conference itself is an important part of academic career development. I'm not sure if anyone has attended a conference before, but they can be quite overwhelming. If it's your first conference, it can feel a little bit sort of difficult or alarming to begin with. So the idea with this is it's kind of a mentored way of attending your first conference in order to know what to expect, in order to sort of progress your academic career, if that's the sort of way that you're planning to go. So the idea, as I said, and as is I think come across in the various emails that we've sent, is that each step of this journey follows the previous step. So all of you had submitted an abstract for the conference, and all of those abstracts have now been accepted. And what the plan is now is to write the conference paper. And then following from the conference paper, we will have a discussion about how to write a conference presentation. So that will be the next event. And then the final sort of step along this journey is hopefully for those who are able, who have time and capacity and have a solid foundation for their conference papers, that they will be able to submit something for publication for a journal within their field. So on that note, whoopsie, these are trying to flip between things, and this is a little bit difficult. There we go. These are the deadlines that we're looking at. So of course, hi, please grab some food. So of course, today is the 2nd of October. This is the workshop today, writing a conference paper, and we're going to go through that step by step. The next deadline you should be aware of is the 25th of October. And that is when we'll expect you to submit a 5,000-word conference paper. And the submission of the conference paper is a requirement in order for us to pay your conference fees, right? So as you'll be aware, conference fees are being paid by the project. This works out to well over 2,000 Rand per student. So what you're getting through this is an enormous benefit, being able to build these soft skills, being able to attend a conference in a way that is a kind of low-hanging fruit. You don't have to make any financial commitments yourselves, but we do require a kind of work commitment, which is the 5,000-word conference paper. So when you submit that, we will pay your conference fees. And then we are going to, on roughly the 28th of October, we're going to give the next workshop in the series, which will be shortly before the conference. And that will be on how to give a conference presentation. So at that particular workshop, we're going to be talking about how to condense your work, how to think about your work in ways that are easily communicated to others, and sort of how to operate in the conference environment, which, as I said, can otherwise be a little bit daunting. And then finally, after the conference, so you'll attend the conference, you'll hopefully go to the conference dinner and have all of the kind of conversations around the conference that are so important about this event. And then following on from that, in November, we hope to assign those who submit the conference papers, revised conference papers. We hope to allocate to them a mentor within their own discipline who is going to look at helping them to refine their papers and submit it to a relevant journal for publication. So that is roughly what our timeline of events looks like. And so, as I said, we're going to have sort of several key workshops, several key events. We're going to help kind of hold your hands through all of this process and sort of enable the attendance at the conference, and all of this with a view to ultimately, hopefully, producing something for publication. But we know that not everyone is going to have the time, or not everyone is going to have the inclination. We also know that lots of people perhaps are not doing as much field work, so it might feel a bit thin. So there's no pressure that you produce a publication at the end of this. But if you're interested in doing that, that is the kind of end goal. So that final stage is going to be much more disciplinary specific, whereas this stage is much more general, and hopefully this conversation is going to be really useful to everyone, regardless of which disciplines you're in, whether you're in media or art or literature or history. So are there any questions at this point? Ethical clearance.
Yes,
sure,
sorry.
Come on in.
It's me, and I have typed the question in the chat box to understand ethical clearance and what is expected in that regard.
Okay, so it's probably worth saying at this point, we're not going to be talking about ethical clearance in this workshop, because it is expected that you already have gained the ethical clearance from your departments, and that the ethics board has reviewed your research and you have started the kind of research process. So if you have questions about ethics, it might be worth asking the person in your discipline about the ethics procedure in that department. So, for example, Joel Quirk is the person who manages the ethics in politics, and he would be the person to ask about any kind of ethics. There won't be a requirement to have it passed through an ethics board in order to present it at the conference, but because we expect that everyone who is here has done some kind of field work, we expect that everyone has gone through a kind of departmental ethics clearance process. So there's no need to have additional ethics in order to present at the conference. If you've gone through the ethics in order to do the research, you should be perfectly fine. If you have any questions, do ask inside your department or your discipline. Okay, are we expected to find a supervisor to assist you? No. Is the conference schedule available? No, I don't think it is available yet. I think they're still finalizing it. I understand that they sent out a bunch of emails today, so perhaps check those emails, just see what was said. I am not on the email list, so I didn't get the emails, so I'm not sure what their sort of timelines look like. Okay, any other questions? Oh,
hello.
yes. Hi, come on in.
You mentioned something about being assigned to a mentor. At what
Yes.
stage is that?
So that's at the sort of very end. So after you've presented at a conference, you're going to be assigned a mentor if you're interested in developing your conference paper for a publication. So at that point, we'll assign you a mentor within your discipline, ideally, or someone who is familiar with the kind of things that you're working on. And then that person will work with you to refine the work in order to submit it for publication.
All right, noted. Thank you.
Cool. Okay, perfect. So moving on to how to write a conference paper. So we felt that all of the projects that were submitted were very strong. And though it is worth saying this is an anthropology conference, so when we were thinking about the kinds of projects that we were submitting to the conference, we felt it was important that the work had some kind of ethnographic or fieldwork-based aspect. So all of the papers that were accepted had some kind of ethnographic or fieldwork-based, research-based sort of aspect to it. And now that you've all been accepted, it's worth saying it's not important that your work is anthropological in focus, right? It doesn't have to be an anthropology paper, and it's not expected that you sort of speak to debates within anthropology. Instead, what we're going to start talking about is how you can develop your own paper in the way that makes sense to you and your discipline. So we're going to proceed under the premise that you don't need to be doing strict anthropology, nor do you need to speak to debates in anthropology during your presentation and during your conference paper. But it is worth thinking that you need to make sure you're speaking to debates within your discipline and debates that are existing sort of in the area that you're doing the research in. So what does a conference paper look like? And we're going to sort of start here, and then I'm going to run for a little bit and we'll open up for more questions. So you'll see on this slide, we termed it responding to the terms of the call. So normally what you would do and what you've already done is write an abstract where you would respond to the call that is being made. The conference normally has a kind of a clear agenda or a topic or a title, and all of you have written more or less to that. And some conferences are more strict about whether or not you meet their kind of terms and title, and some conferences are not that concerned. This conference the title was very loosely applied, and they weren't that concerned that we made sure that everything fitted into the terms. So that was useful enough. In terms of identifying a suitable stream, normally what you would do if you were cold applying to a conference is you'd have to look through all the streams that are available and identify one which aligns most clearly with your paper and with your research interests, and then you'd submit to that stream. But of course, what we did is we did a group submission. So we sort of got all the papers together and we allocated them into different panels, and those panels will be allocated into streams. It's worth saying that generally when you're applying to a conference, luck is an important factor in whether or not you're accepted. So when you're applying to a stream or a panel, often people who are convening those streams or panels already have papers in mind. They have colleagues that they want to work with, colleagues who are presenting, who have arranged to present in the same panel or stream. So if you apply to a panel or a stream and you're not accepted, don't be disheartened, because often luck is a really important part of why you haven't been accepted. Yeah. Okay. So, your paper for the conference. The most important thing to note is that in a conference paper, you just cannot say everything you want to say. So, conference papers are generally quite a small, confined amount of research. It's much smaller than, for example, a dissertation. And most of you are giving papers that are based on your dissertations, right? So in a dissertation, you have a lot to say. You have multiple types of arguments, multiple chapters, multiple threads that you're pulling at. You might be engaging with multiple literatures, and you might be thinking about different case studies. So it's often not just a single case or just a single argument, but theses tend to be much more complicated and much larger. So you have a lot to say in your thesis research. You cannot say everything that you say in your thesis in your conference paper. It's just not possible. So what you need to do is find the right way to sort of narrow down. So you can only really realistically say something that is more or less one chapter's worth, right? You can bring out the argument from a single chapter of your thesis and then sort of fit that into a conference presentation. You can't say everything you want to say, because if you sort of need to talk about all the literatures that you're engaging with in your thesis, you'll spend the whole presentation just talking about the literature reviews. So you need to make sure that you're keeping it confined, that it's a relatively small amount of work. It's a single distinct argument, and it follows a kind of clear line. And that clear line and the distinct argument need to be based both within the literature that you're speaking to, and it needs to be based on a single kind of case or bit of empirical research. So what I would suggest is that you need to take something that's very big and make it a smaller thing that is much more contained and digestible for a conference presentation. As a PhD student, the way you're going to do this is you're going to take a little bit of your literature review, a little bit of your theory chapter, and ground that in an analysis of your empirics. So you're going to pair the theory with a case from your empirical chapter that works with the theory that you want to consider, right? An empirical case, but you're going to need to make it smaller than your existing arguments. So it's worth saying, again, a conference paper is really not the same as a dissertation or the same as a journal article. It is a much smaller, more contained piece of research, but it still needs to follow the same kinds of logics that we use in all of our research papers. So it needs to have an introduction, it needs to have a brief literature review, it needs to engage with the kind of theoretical base and then sort of ground all of that in an empirical base. You can't spend the conference paper talking about all of your empirics. So if you have done a lot of research, you might want to try to keep it to a sort of much more confined, smaller set of cases, smaller set of interviews, smaller set of research empirics that will make it a little bit more digestible in a kind of conference format. Instead, if you try and describe all of your empirics that are in your thesis, you're probably going to spend the entire 15, 20 minutes talking just about the empirics. And what you need to make sure you can do is you can insert a kind of comprehensive conversation about what it is that you're doing, how that relates to what's been done before, and what the overall argument is that you're building and how that is different, innovative, and novel. So you might also, I know there's a lot of master's students here and there's 1 or 2 honors students. You also want to think about, as a kind of honors or master's student where you have a much shorter thesis, you want to make sure you're using your best empirical work. You use that as your case, you build your theory and your theory chapter around that as the contextualization. So how are we going to do this? At a very practical level, it's worth thinking about it in kind of bite-sized chunks. So the introduction should be about 500 words, probably no more than 500 words. That's about a page or so. And the introduction must do the same kinds of things that you would do in all of your introductions. You need to say a little bit about what the broader question is, what the broader project is, a tiny amount about what the empirical base is, and what the methodology is. So that's the introduction. And then you want to start on the literature review. And we're going to talk a bit more about that. But your literature review and your methodology section, because you should put them together, your literature review and methodology section should be no more than a third of your paper. So if your conference paper is 5,000 words, you want to think about the introduction, literature review, and methodology being no more than 2,000. It needs to be much smaller. You want to spend 2/3 of this paper talking about your empirics and your argument and why your argument matters. So, of course, it's worth saying that you need to think about this as a distinctive standalone piece of work. In a thesis, you can often point to things that exist in other chapters. So you can say in chapter 4, I argue that, but you can't do that in a conference paper. You need to make sure it stands alone. You've included all of the research, all of the literature that you're engaging with, and all of the empirics that you need to make the argument you're going to make. So just talking again to the PowerPoint, on point 3, you need to make sure you pay your respects to the literature. Let's talk about that. So that is essentially the literature review. As you would do in any kind of academic writing, you need to make sure you're contextualizing your work within existing debates in your discipline. And how do you want to do that? So normally what we would do in a thesis or a piece of research that's submitted for a degree, we would expect you to expand a lot on each author and each argument. But you can't do that in a conference paper. It needs to be much shorter and much more sort of confined. So what you want to think about is instead sort of bunching citations together. So you need to make sure you cite everyone or all of the major authors who are writing in this area, right? So if we're talking about, if you're writing something on apartheid history, you want to recognize the people who have written in the broad area of apartheid history. So you might say, many scholars have written on apartheid history and in the 21st century and how it has shaped 21st century South Africa. And then in brackets, you might have like 3 or 4 or 6 citations, right? You want to bunch those citations together and sort of recognize that you're sort of citing all of the people who have talked about the way in which apartheid history is affecting 21st century South Africa. Of course, this is a very non-specific argument, so that would be far more than 6 authors, but your area of research would be much smaller, right? So if you're writing about the way in which campaign rallies in Africa are held, you might only have 5 or 6 authors. If you're writing on something that is much bigger, you just want to make sure you're picking out the key authors who have done the kind of more general, larger analyses. So you'd say, there are many works that talk about the impact of apartheid history on 21st century South African politics. And you might cite 3 to 5 authors. And then you would say, so within this, there are several authors who are going to be looking at the way in which apartheid history has shaped 21st century politics of the opposition in South Africa. And there might be 2 or 3 authors that you're talking about. And then if you're talking about the way that the opposition functions and the kinds of arguments that it makes, there's probably just 3 or 4 authors who have published on this sort of smaller area. And it's those 3 or 4 interlocutors that you want to make sure you're developing much more in the conference paper, right? So when you're thinking about this, you want to think about paying your respects to the literature, paying your respects to everyone who's written on this topic, or at least the kind of key authors, and then picking just a couple whose arguments you expand on much more. And this is a really difficult skill to learn when it comes to academia. It's a really hard thing to learn to do because, of course, you need to have a sense of how the broad field sits together and what the key arguments and debates are. So what you want to do is spend 1 or 2 paragraphs looking at what those key debates are within the broader field, and then really dig into what the debates are within the very specific case that you're going to be looking at. So within that, you want to make sure you're saying something really sort of, you're expanding on the work of 2 or 3 key theorists or 2 or 3 key scholars who are working in exactly the same area as you, or who are working on a kind of theory that is applicable to your case, that you're using to kind of do some theory development or theory testing, etc. So you need to make sure, as I said, you have a really solid literature review that does this kind of like looking at the bigger picture and then sort of bunching in citations and then bringing it down, narrowing and narrowing until you get to your kind of key area of interest. And this is a skill that's really useful to have more broadly for academic writing, because what you'll notice is that in a dissertation, we ask you to sort of elaborate much more on the way that the literature sort of develops. But actually in journal articles, the way that it functions is much more like this. People are bunching in citations, making sure they're citing the key authors, but not expanding that much on the bigger research area, largely keeping it confined to their smaller, more niche area of interest and area of research. And so if you're not entirely sure how to do this, I would recommend looking at one of the journal articles that you really like and that you're using for your research, that you think is well written, and just sort of looking at the way that the literature review is written, because it gives you a good sense of exactly how to write this for a conference paper. It's much the same kind of skill. And then you need to make sure you can talk about what about your argument is a distinctive part of this sort of larger debate and what is your distinctive contribution. And then finally, it's worth saying a conference paper is really just the first draft of your article for submission. So this is the kind of first crack at sort of this argument, and it doesn't have to be perfect, but it needs to be good enough to present. Okay, so talking a little bit more in depth about each of these things. As I've already said, you can't say everything. Your dissertation just isn't going to be, it just isn't going to fit. What you want to think about is a dissertation chapter, but you can't just submit a dissertation chapter, right? Because of course the dissertation chapter refers to many other things in the rest of the dissertation. So it will need to be substantially reworked. Think about taking your best empirical chapter, taking bits of your theory, taking bits from your methodology, and taking bits from your literature review, and then sort of combining that into a much smaller piece of work. So focus on a chapter that has a strong empirical foundation. And as I said, you know, you're going to be submitting a 5,000 word conference paper. Journal articles are normally 7,000 to 9,000 words. 5,000 words is actually a very small amount of writing, and you have to keep it super confined. So in terms of this, you want to make sure you're just picking out the best bits of your research, and you're just linking that to the best bits of your empirics. So again, talking about how you're writing your literature review, you need to make sure you're paying your respects, you're doing it very quickly, you're distilling the key points in the debate, and you're sort of talking about where you stand within that debate, right? That's one of the most important things. So the way we think about that is when we're writing the kind of literature review and the introduction, you want to say, essentially, here's what has been done, here's what I'm doing, and here's why what I'm doing is different and or distinct to what's already out there. The literature review should be short and sharp. It needs to contain a lot of citations and brackets, and then expand on 1 or 2 or 3 key scholars or theories around which you're going to develop your argument. So again, sort of start big, go smaller, and then get into your empirics. That's the most important thing. A conference paper essentially needs to have about 25 to 30 references. And most of these references are going to be in short succession. They're going to be these kind of bunched up ones in brackets, or multiple citations in a single footnote. And then at the end of your literature review section, what you want to do is you want to say what you're doing and how you're doing it, and give a brief outline of the evidence that you're going to use to make your argument. So it's really important to make sure that at every point you're talking about your key argument. Yeah.
The last point that you said.
Yes.
So what at the end of the literature review, we're going to write down what we're doing, how we're doing it, and you said something about that last point. You said something about
the evidence.
Yes.
Yeah. So that comes in with how you're doing it, right? So you would say something like, these scholars make this argument about contemporary South Africa. I am making an argument that apartheid history influences opposition politics and political party rallies in this key way, that opposition parties and rallies are more complex and speak more to racial issues, and the evidence I'm using to demonstrate this is my attendance at 12 key rallies. So that's how you do it. You just want to have a sort of very brief section about what your argument is and how you're going to make it. And then you're going to move on. So I realize I spent most of my time describing these things already on the kind of outline slide. So we're going to just go over it again, just to make sure we've covered these points, but I'm not going to do so in depth. So it's important, nest it within the literature and make sure you cite. And I can't emphasize this enough. It is really important to make sure that you cite all of the key authors and you talk about them in your presentation and your conference paper, because if you don't, the likelihood is that you'll get a grumpy person in the room whose work might be relevant on this topic, and they say, well, you didn't cite X person, so I'm not sure that what you're saying is new is actually all that new, right? And this is really important at conference level because it can really throw you off in a conference presentation. It can undermine the kind of feedback that you get, where you might get something much more useful. And you end up getting people who said, oh, well, so-and-so has already written on this. Why didn't you mention them? So it's really important to include those citations. And then when it comes to the publication, it's all the more important, right? If you're submitting it to a journal and the journal editor thinks you've sort of left out key authors and you're not talking about their key arguments, then they're probably going to get grumpy and reject the article. So you need to make sure that you're sort of paying your respects, you're citing the key authors, and you also, while doing that, leave enough space to make your argument. So that's why kind of bunching these citations in the way I've discussed is really useful. And as I said, roughly 1/3 of your paper should be ideally concerned with the literature and where you stand within it. And then we have the so what question. So once you've spoken about the literature, the next point is, so what, right? So here's what the literature all says. And then that's where you need to say, okay, so this is what everyone says. This is what the literature says. Here is what I have. And here is why what I have is insulated from skeptics saying, oh, this isn't new, right? So you need to say something about how and why what you're saying and doing is new or different to what already exists and what you've already outlined in the literature review. And when we're thinking about what's new, this can be something that's quite stressful for postgrad students because it feels like something has been written on everything and you're trying really hard to find something new and novel. And so try not to get too stressed about it because there are many ways that we can bring something new to a debate, right? There's literally hundreds of thousands of scholars. There are thousands of people writing on thousands of topics at any one time. So it's okay. There's going to be people who have written on this topic. What you need to think about is something new. So you might take an existing theory and apply new evidence. Often the thing that's new is bringing a debate up to date with new empirical material. So maybe the debate of the key author that you're looking at ended in the 1990s, right? Their last paper on this topic was written in the 1990s. And you're saying, well, what has happened in the last 30 years? So as I said, bringing the debate around how opposition parties campaign into the 21st century, looking at the way that it's shaped by apartheid history. That's an example. So that would be bringing something new. You're bringing new evidence. You're bringing a debate up to date with new empirical material. Or perhaps you're comparing to something new, right? You're making a comparison between two cases that haven't been compared before. So, for example, you're interested in party politics in Benin and in Zambia, and those cases haven't been compared before, right? That's something that's new. Or a new way of analyzing or looking at an existing theory, right? There are lots of ways to find something new, and the bar for an original contribution at this point in a conference paper is much smaller, right? So you don't have to think about it in the way that you would with a journal article. The bar for original contribution is much higher, but this is the kind of first step on that journey. So we're thinking about what's new, what's novel, how's it different to what exists already in the literature? Are you taking a new look at some existing theory? Are you adding a kind of new aspect or consideration to an existing theory? Are you bringing new evidence to the table? Are you comparing new cases that haven't been compared before? But basically what you want to make sure is that you're sort of highlighting what is new about your particular piece of research. That is very, very important. Why should people be concerned about the literature that you've just outlined? And why is it that what you're presenting is important or novel or different? And then you need to start to say something very briefly about what your case is, what your evidence is, and how that evidence allows you to say something new and something different that hasn't been covered already. That's linked to your empirical research, exactly. So what's in the literature review is just what has been said by all the scholars in this area. The evidence is going to be what's your empirical research saying. No. Exactly. You just want to make sure you're sort of continuing the conversation from the literature review. It's clear that what you're researching links back to that, but you don't need to bring that all in right the way through. And then you want to talk about your argument, right? What is your argument? Your argument should, and it's really important to state this, your argument should be in your introduction, in your abstract, in the end of the literature review, in the main body, and in the conclusion. And what you want to say is you need to make sure you're talking about your argument, how it's original, what evidence you supply, and or what your methods are. So it's really important. You don't want to spend a lot of time on your methods. You don't want to say too much about, you know, I used snowball sampling and identifying people to interview, but you need to make sure there's enough there to make it clear why your methods fit what you're trying to say, right? So if I am doing an analysis of election rallies in the 21st century, but my method is to go into the archives, which are 30 years old, there's obviously a mismatch between my argument and my evidence. But of course, if you're doing interviews or participant observation of election rallies, then it's quite clear. You don't need to say that much about the ethics application process or how you selected which rallies to go to, though you want to say something about that, or how you selected the interviewees, but you want to make sure you've said enough that it's kind of clear that these things are touched on, but you don't want to spend that much time talking about your methods. You want to make sure you devote the majority of your paper to your argument and your evidence. And then again, just to sort of talk about this idea, you know, what is new, what's different, what's novel. We can talk about this in multiple different ways. You could be updating the research, as I said, you could be testing a theory against a different case. You could be expanding on an argument that already exists or on a case that already exists, or you're connecting to literatures that haven't been connected before, or you're comparing to cases that haven't been compared before. And the most important thing to say is that a conference paper shouldn't be a murder mystery. Right? You shouldn't have to wait to the end to find out what the argument is. You need to make sure that your argument is in the introduction, in the abstract, at the end of the literature review, in the main body, and in the conclusion of the paper. The argument needs to be absolutely clear. And this is often something that with postgraduates is very difficult to do, right? Because you're in the middle of it, and you're trying to figure it out, and you're trying to figure out the working parts. And it's a very hard thing to sort of say definitively, what is my argument, what am I proving, and how is it different? So what you want to be able to do is open up a clear Word document and say something like, the principal argument of this paper is, and then finish that sentence. And it can't be an extremely long paragraph. You need to be able to say, the principal argument of this paper is that apartheid history shapes how opposition parties hold election rallies by forcing them into a conversation about race. My evidence for this is my attendance at 12 election rallies and 10 interviews with opposition leaders, right? That is it. The principal argument of this paper is, and you need it to be clear, to be concise, and to emerge from the evidence that you present. And of course, there needs to be the connection between your argument, your evidence, and the literature that you're citing.
Can you start with a question?
Yes. So the principal question that this paper is going to analyze or is going to engage with. So you can absolutely have a question. Yeah, definitely.
Okay, so we can start with the question, but say make it or
Yeah. Yeah, so you could say the question that this paper engages with is, does apartheid history shape how opposition parties campaign? And then after that, you would say, the argument that I would like to offer is, it does shape it, and it shapes it in these ways. And this is the evidence that I have for why that's the case. And this is different to what exists because it brings up to date a debate from the 1990s, or it looks at cases that haven't been analyzed before, or no one's looked at this question, but that's probably quite unlikely. Okay. Then it's worth saying again, article drafts can be quite stressful, right? Submitting something to a journal feels like a bar that is very hard to jump over, and it feels like something that is very unattainable. This is not yet a journal article draft. And so don't think of it in those terms. Think of this very much as a work in progress. So for anyone who's attended a conference before, you probably know that a lot of people write their conference papers on the flight to the conference. Or very senior scholars will arrive and they just have bullet points, and they'll speak to those bullet points and they'll figure out what their principal argument is along the way, right? Conferences are places where people are testing ideas and testing out their research. And you can think about your own paper in the same way. But it's not really best practice to have just bullet points, especially at the postgraduate level. Because you're not that familiar with the field, because it all feels quite new and can be a bit daunting, you want to make sure you have a really solid conference paper. You're citing all the literature that you can. You don't have to be citing absolutely everyone at this point. We don't expect you to know the entire field as a postgraduate student, but you must make sure you're kind of citing as many as possible and citing the key authors. You need to pay your respects and you need to cite your literature, but you're not expected to be an expert at postgrad level. So a kind of conference paper is a way to test your ideas, to test your theories, to get good feedback, and it's really useful for all of those things. It doesn't need to be perfect, and it doesn't need to be essentially a draft article. As I said, a draft article is going to be 7,000 to 9,000 words. This is a 5,000 word paper. So you can think about this very much as the kind of beginnings, the formulations for a draft article. This is where it would start, but it doesn't have to be a draft article yet, and it doesn't have to be perfect. And then finally, submit your conference paper. So please submit your conference paper to us. It should be about 5,000 words, should not be dot points or incomplete fragments. I'll send this round, don't worry. It has to be an actual paper. And as I said in the beginning, once you send it to us, we will be paying your conference fees, so you will have a fully free ride at the conference. And the conference is going to be at WITS. And all of these things are an enormous benefit. As I said, there's about 2,000 Rand per student that we're going to be paying. So it's a really big and important kind of opportunity. So make sure you submit the conference paper, then we will pay your conference fees for you. And hopefully we will move on to the next stage of this process. So I'm now going to open up for questions. We can have as many rounds of questions as everyone likes. This is not the end of the conversation, so if there was anything you don't understand and you kind of think about it later, you're always welcome to email us on this email address. But if there's anything that wasn't clear or would be helpful to repeat, does anyone have a question, comment? Dress code at a conference. Oh, controversial. I would say don't come in slippers and a gown. Probably what you would wear to a kind of lecture, right? So it should be something like smart casual. You want to look like you're respectful of others and respectful of the decorum of the place, but it doesn't have to be like a suit and tie kind of event. Does that make sense? Was there any other questions? And we're going to talk a lot more about conferences and what to expect at a conference at the next one. So when we talk about how to give a conference paper, which is going to be in a couple of weeks. Now just go all the way back. There we go. So We're going to give a talk in the next one on how to give a conference presentation and what to expect from a conference. And that's where we're going to talk about these kinds of things, right? So how does one sit and engage within the conference environment, what to wear, who to talk to, how to make the most of it, all of that kind of stuff.
Questions.
Still, aspects, right? I know Joel said that he's gonna put his panels instead of like an individual thing. So how's it gonna work when it comes to our conference papers and presenting them?
So you're going to be you are already assigned to a panel, and you're going to, essentially a panel is just a series of like 3 papers that all happen in one room on the same day at the same slot. And so he's assigned those already. He kind of looked at thematic fit, which papers seem to align with other papers. So some were on LGBT rights, and so those ones kind of got grouped together. Some were on certain kinds of politics or, I can't remember the exact panels that he put together, but he sort of grouped them all together. And so the way it's going to work is on that day, you'll show up in the same place as the other people giving the papers in that panel, and you'll have the same audience and you'll debate amongst each other, basically, and ask each other questions. Does that answer your question?
Oh, yes. If I want to finish this, let's say this weekend, and send it to you, who do I send it to?
Send it to the Everything Everywhere Gmail account. So it's this one at the end. Everything Everywhere Bits at gmail.com. And yeah, as I said, ideally by the 25th of October, if you can send it sooner, that's great. It should be at least 5,000 words, and not sort of bullet points.
I sort of asked this last time.
Yeah.
Literature and the methodology with one.
Yes.
Yeah. But yeah, it's just something I'm sure, I don't know if there's any solutions there.
Yeah.
Because there was like this thing of do not section it and say methodology, just flow from it.
Yeah. So basically, conference papers don't have headings like introduction, methodology, research question. What you might say is something like you would have, obviously you would have an introduction and you would have the start of your paper, and then you might say an overview of the literature on political party rallies in Africa, right? That would be the kind of title that you're using. And then within that, you would talk about the literature. And then after that, you would start talking about your case. So you would say the case of opposition parties in South Africa and apartheid history. And that's where you'd kind of delve into your argument a bit more.
And then if
So yes, you would kind of infuse the methodology there.
So those introductory sentences are so simple but effective.
Yes,
Yeah.
exactly. And that's also something that's quite useful to think about. So when you're writing academic work, you want every paragraph to stand alone, right? Every paragraph should be a separate idea. Every paragraph should have an introductory sentence and a concluding sentence that links it back to your argument. And so every paragraph must build then upon the next paragraph or upon the previous paragraph. So these are kind of like building blocks that build towards an argument. And the methodology, you can say very briefly in the introduction, and then you will say at the end of the literature review, you'll say, here is all the literature I presented. My research links to this by talking about this, and this is my research and evidence, right? And this is how I'm going to proceed with the next section of this research, of this conference paper. So yeah, you want to keep the methodology pretty small, but you want to make sure it's clear how you did the research. Does that make sense? There is a question online. Do you want to ask your question? There's two.
Yes, Doug.
Hey.
Yes, Doug. Can you hear me?
I can, yes.
Yes, I just wanted to find out if there is an opportunity to submit before the 25th of October, just to get the inputs. Because my worry is that just the 25th will be like a final draft that will go to the conference. So I just wanted to find out, can I just submit before, maybe in the next 2 weeks, and then I get inputs, it comes back and deal with it, whether I'm actually cracking it or what?
Yeah,
Is there that
sure.
assistance? Who should I
Yes.
submit to?
Submit
To
it
you?
there to that everythingeverywherevits.gmail.com.
Yes.
And we will endeavor to get you some feedback. It's worth saying that the conference paper itself isn't going to be submitted to the conference. So you don't need to worry. This is the basis of your presentation, but you're not submitting it to anyone but us at this point. So no sort of overall scholar is going to see this and sort of judge it for not being perfect at this point. This is the first step towards doing the conference presentation, where you'll speak to this paper, but you're not necessarily going to read the whole paper out. But if you really want feedback and you're able to get it in before the 25th, we will endeavor to get you feedback as soon as we can. It is also worth saying it is currently like honors thesis submission time and things are all a little bit hectic. So we are all a bit pressed in terms of our time pressures, but we will absolutely do our best. There was one more hand up. Do you want to?
Yes, Doc. Thank you so much for
Sure.
this presentation. And I know you've like explained very much in detail, but I just wanted to ask if it's possible. I remember the last time we had a session like this, we were actually given examples of how to go about writing an abstract, and that was very helpful. And I just wanted to know, in this instance, is there no way maybe we can just get a template or just like an example of what a conference paper would look like, if it's possible?
Okay, I'll chat to Joel and I'll see if we can pull something together.
Thank you so much.
Okay. So as I said, I'm going to be circulating these slides. I'm also going to send around the audio recording of this. And then you'll have this as a kind of something you can sort of look at again and just check that you've kind of covered all of your bases. But also, as I said, this conference paper is a sort of the first step. It's a work in progress. You're not going to be submitting it to the conference. You don't need to worry that senior scholars in your area are going to be judging it and the basis of your work, right? Buhle.
So you say that the conference paper will not be shared with the panel.
No.
So when we are presenting, what are we going to be using? Like slides? Are we going to be using slides?
So it's up to you, and we're going to talk about that in the next workshop. But essentially, this is your development of your argument, right? And then in the presentation, you're going to be presenting on the argument. But you need to think about that because the presentation is going to be 15 to 20 minutes long. There's only so much you can say in 15 to 20 minutes. But you need to make sure you have a full conference paper that backs up your presentation because it helps you develop the argument. Make sure that your argument is based in the literature, that it speaks to the literature, that it's sort of speaking clearly to your evidence, and that you're able to articulate the points of your argument really soundly. So this is a kind of paper that's part of the development of the broader argument that you're going to be making at the conference paper, at the conference itself. Does that make sense?
Yes, that makes sense. So the time is 20 to 25 minutes.
Usually it's 15 to 20 minutes. Yeah.
Oh,
and we
15 to
should
20
find out closer to the time exactly how long will be allocated per paper. But it's often slots of between 1 hour 45 to 2 hours. And there's normally 3 papers. So if they're 20 minutes each, that's an hour, and then roughly an hour for discussion. But it really depends on the conference. It's not particularly standardized. Okay.
All right, noted. Thank you. That's clear.
Great. Any more questions? Anything that wasn't clear? Anyone need any help with anything else? Okay, if there's nothing else, then I'm going to wrap it up here. I will send the slides and hopefully an example and also the recording. And we will see you at the end of the month once you've all sent your conference papers through.
No pressure.
No pressure. And also just to say thank you everyone again for making time today. I really appreciate it. And good luck with the next couple of weeks. I know everyone's very pressured at this time of year. So thanks everyone. And feel free to drop us an email if there's anything that you need assistance with. All right.